You can't go to war and expect to have an immunity. I got hit with a shell and it was nasty, and but it taught me what it's like to be wounded for the first time in my life. To feel the warmth of my own blood running down from my crotch and down my legs and having lumps of burning metal in my legs. It did me a favor in a way, because it straightened me out a bit more, and I realized what the price of war really means. I never really intended to be a photographer. I wasn't one of those people who, at the age of 15, saying, I'm going to be a photographer or a fighter pilot. You didn't where I came from. All you thought about was getting through that day and the next day, because you knew there would be some physical challenge in your life, and it usually came down to a bit of violence. And then when I eventually left to go and do my national service, I requested the RAF, and I also requested, when I got into the RAF, that I wanted to go to a photographic unit, because I thought, it'd be an easier option. There'd be no square bashing, and there'd be no, military life. And I wound up in Egypt, and I started learning darkroom work and stuff like that. It was my first step in photography. After 2 years, I'd acquired a camera, and I came back to Finsbury Park. But there was no great call on me to exercise my photographic interest, until one day, and the boys I grew up with said, you've got that camera, why don't you go and, get it and take some pictures, There was a clash at the bottom of my street where I took that photograph, and a policeman tried to separate the two gangs involved, one the people I grew up with and the invaders, the attackers, and the policeman was killed. So suddenly I had pictures of one of the gangs, and I got their blessing to take them to the Observer newspaper, who published them, but asked me to do some more pictures at the same time, which I did. And overnight, I was offered every job in England. That one picture was the seed that was the beginning of my growth into photography, but I had to find out what photography really meant, and I started doing just that, buying magazines, talking to other young photographers and learning from them, and learning from images from all over the world's photographic world. Once I started getting bits of knowledge, I couldn't be stopped then. The battle in Limassol in 1964 was the very first live battle that I was engaged in. And once the battle started, I don't know why, but I felt as if I could handle it. Somehow I was excited, and I was driven by my excitement and speed. I found myself running all over the place for no apparent reason, because I was wound up and I had this youth and this energy. And then I calmed down and I started picking off pictures. The first picture I took was the man running from the cinema, looking like a film still himself, with a small Sten gun and a raincoat, looking more like a Sicilian bandit than a Turkish gunman, trying to defend his neighborhood. I was the only one in that Battle of Limassol, and it was all mine. And I wasn't looking over my shoulder about what the other people were doing, because they weren't there. So it was another blessing to give me this amazing start in my life as a photographer. And I'm going to say photographer because one of the things I loathe is being thought of as a war photographer. Of course I went to many wars, but that doesn't mean I have to have this terrible name. And I've always sought to be recognized as just a photographer. I just happened to go to an awful lot of wars. It's exciting, and I'd be a liar if I didn't actually own up to the fact. But it wasn't until I walked into a school in Biafra in the war in 1969 did I see hundreds of dying children. Then I realized it was like someone really socking it to me and saying, you've been doing it all wrong so far. You've got this whole thing wrong. You've got to shape up and, and start looking at things the way they are. This isn't Hollywood. This is, people's lives. So I did a complete pirouette on what I'd been engaged in, and then came back into these situations as a different person. I reached a point with the images to try and bring them back, as tough as they are, to try and persuade people to believe that what you see in this picture of the dying children in Africa was simply not right. And I wasn't a crusader, but I went to these wars quite voluntarily, and I took the air ticket and got on the airplane. When I got there, I would never shy away from what was truly horrible. We don't live in a black and white world, but somehow you take the black and white still, for instance, the picture of the Vietnamese peasant staring at you. That man's looking at you in the most accusing way. And I wasn't an American soldier. He thought I was an American soldier with a camera. You can see the hatred in his eyes. And, you know, I think I pulled it off to show you that hatred. I stamped my approval on it by my darkness. I have a darkness in me, which is understandable, I'm sure you would agree. You know, I go darker and darker. I was engaged in something at that stage where people started asking me questions. I always thought I could go to war, take pictures in any way, and I wouldn't be vulnerable to give explanation. I feel uncomfortable about all the war pictures because, you know, I've made a name for myself in photography. It's at the expense of other people's lives. So when it comes to liking my war pictures, frankly, I don't. What I'm more pleased about are my landscape pictures. I'm really thrilled with this picture of Hadrian's Wall just after a snowstorm. It's like a Victorian melodrama to look at it. The sun has turned into the moon almost. I was so happy, and I was standing on that wall, which is now only like as tall as me, and it used to be 10 meters tall. But I think over the centuries, the locals have been stealing the stone to make their own houses with. I mean, the temptation was too great because it's all freshly cut stone, so it was tailor-made for making your own house. I thought, you brought yourself to this and you admire this, but don't stop for a second and think this was put up free of human charge. You know, it was like somebody paid for all this. So I can never seem to get somewhere where I don't have a kind of flashback. But the only place I can get to, where I do have no flashback, is the English countryside, where I live in Somerset. You know, I swing my leg over the edge of my garden fence and go down to a valley beneath my house, and you know, I'm lost in landscape. It's fantastic. It's the only salvation that I've got out of photography after 50 years.